Vaults of Terra. My name is Ed, and today we will be starting our two-part series on the history of the Imperium. Now, we thought we'd start with the history of the Imperium, as that is a good basis for the rest of the lore that will come later, and it helps explain some of the background that you may or may not know, considering the large amount of knowledge that is required to operate within the Warhammer 40,000 universe. We will be starting with the ages of mankind, and then we'll be focusing in on some of the specific events. We will start with the Age of Terra. Now, the Age of Terra started now, essentially. It is any time between the birth of human civilization, which is considered 10,000 years BC usually, right up until the 15th millennium. This is a time when humanity was mainly confined to Earth, but eventually spread out to the rest of the solar system, namely Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and all those other planets, in the search for more resources as we slowly drained Earth's resources. Now, there's not a lot known about this period in history from the imperial perspective, but they do know three major facts which aren't widely shared but are quite material to our knowledge. Now, the first of these facts is that the Emperor is born in this period, in the 8th millennium BC. Now, from our perspective, that's 10,000 years ago, and that will be an incredible amount of time, considering that makes him 50,000 years old in the 41st millennium. Other events that took place during this period were the birth of the Chaos gods Tzeentch, Khorne, and Nurgle. Now, it's not known how they were born, but it's presumed that because of the rise in humanity's numbers and the amount of violence and war that was taking place in that period, it eventually coalesced in the Immaterium, also known as the Warp, and formed these entities which are known today as the Chaos gods. And finally, humanity managed to spread to the rest of the solar system by the 15th millennium, meaning that that is the period when they began to expand beyond this section of stars and out into the wider galaxy. Next up is the Dark Age of Technology. Now, the Dark Age of Technology was actually the height of humanity's civilization, despite the fact it's quite a long time in the past, from the perspective from which we see it. And it was the time when humanity reached its zenith in regards to science, technology, and knowledge. It's a time when we knew huge amounts, and it is considered one of the golden ages of humanity, despite the fact that many consider it a bad age because we evolved beyond what many would consider our remit. We invented artificial technologies, artificial intelligences, many different technologies which took away from the human experience and thus was considered to damn us from the perspective of the Imperium these days. But more likely we became very enamoured with ourselves, and thus this led to the Age of Strife later on. Now, more about the Dark Age of Technology. It was between the 15th millennium and the 25th millennium, depending on what dates you use, and it is made up of several different sections, which can be used as historical marker points. Now, the first of these marker points is the Stellar Exodus, and this was the earliest time of human colonization of other worlds. This is when humanity hadn't even developed warp-capable vessels yet, and so everyone had to travel about on sublight vehicles. Now, this meant that voyages between stars took decades, if not centuries, depending on where you were going. Trade was virtually unknown, and despite the fact humanity managed to start their colonies on other worlds, very little contact was had between these colonies, and eventually that meant that they involved their own cultures and own civilizations. Later on was the development of warp drive. Now, we all know about warp drive if you have any knowledge of the background of Warhammer, but for those who don't, it's essentially a technology that can take you out of the real universe and into a parallel universe, a crazy, messed up universe where there's no physics to speak of, and that will allow you to bridge 2 points in the galaxy very quickly, although it requires a lot of skill to use. Now, the first type of warp drives were very short style drives. They only allowed people to go into the warp for very short periods, as they had yet to discover the navigator gene, and thus it was very hard to navigate within the warp. Despite the fact that the Geller fields prevented any demonic incursions into spaceships, it was still very difficult to navigate anywhere without getting lost in the warp. Eventually this meant that the warp drive carried humanity to the furthest corners of the galaxy, although it took a very long time, and this was only accelerated with the development of the navigators, as I mentioned before. This was discovered in the later part of the Dark Age of Technology, and this was when humanity discovered that some people had developed a warp sense. This sort of third eye, which eventually did become a third eye in Mutant Quarters, was enabling these people to see the currents of the warp, see how it flowed and moved, and allowed people to actually navigate between the stars. This would require later developments, but it did mean that at this point humanity could travel huge distances very, very quickly. Finally, for the Dark Age of technology, one of the most important things that we developed was the standard template construct system. Now, this is something you'll hear repeated many times in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and an STC is a device that stores knowledge, huge amounts of knowledge, libraries and libraries worth, beyond terabytes worth of information. Everything about a certain technology, or in fact all technologies, could be found in standard template constructs. And even in the 41st millennium, people still hunt these devices that were the height of human storage capacity, although they've never found one that's complete, i.e. never found the complete range of human knowledge, although they've managed to make many advances from these standard template constructs that they have found. Now, through this exploration and eventual travelling of the galaxy, humanity became very wealthy in both knowledge and power. However, this had led to an arrogance that made people believe that they had become a godlike species with power over everyone. They began to make war on other alien species, and they just considered that humans versus aliens was a trivial matter. In fact, they considered that humanity's technology was so powerful it could negate any alien threat. However, what they hadn't predicted was the rise of psychers. Now, psychers, obviously, are people with psychic abilities. They were confirmed in this period, but they never really had any knowledge of their potential, right up until the danger of demonic possession began. Now, it's not known why it didn't happen instantly with these people manifesting their powers, but it was mainly thought because that there were so few people at this period with psychic gifts, it was quite hard for a demon to actually impose itself on a person without the person either going mad or dying, and thus no one ever really knowing about it. However, at the end of the Dark Age of technology, people found that these demonic possessions were becoming more and more regular, psychers were becoming more and more dangerous, and people were beginning to realise that they were not in control as much as they once thought. Now, inevitably, the Golden Age of humanity did end, and it was very, very violent, it has to be said, especially considering the universe. Now, humanity was at the height of their power when suddenly a huge number of warp storms began to occur within the warp. Now, a warp storm is essentially a massive vortices in this parallel dimension that makes it almost impossible for navigation to occur, even if people have navigators on board their ships. And thus, the trade and prosperity that linked all human worlds together was severed. And suddenly, humanity was plunged into this period of complete and utter isolation from one another. Now, it was a very worrying time for humanity, as many places such as Earth were relying on these trade routes to feed themselves and clothe themselves. Virtually all the natural resources that were being now imported from other worlds. And so, without this supply line, anarchy was the rule of the day. And as humanity became more and more cut off, psychers began to become more and more prevalent. And all this can be related to the Eldar, because at this period they were on their rise of decadence, as they had risen to power many thousands and thousands of years before humanity, and now had stagnated to a point where they were becoming obsessed with pleasure, as many societies do when they reach their height. And so this was being reflected in the warp by these warp storms, and would eventually lead to the birth of Slanesh, the Chaos God and fourth god of the Pantheon, although that will be in the later part of a video. However, obviously this disruption of the warp network did lead to the downfall of humanity's Dark Age of technology. Many worlds were cut off, and many versions of humanity began to evolve in small pocket empires, which I will mention later. Now, the next age, after the Age of Terra and after the Dark Age of technology, is the Age of Strife. It's also known as the Old Night in a lot of the background lore, and this is the most destructive and anarchic period within history of humanity. It was a regressive time when people were locked into one planet after thousands and thousands of years of prosperity. This period lasted almost 5,000 years, And obviously all the advantages that we'd had were based around our massive network of warp ships capable of transporting many people many thousands of light years. And so, in the end, people were left with nothing. And that was the problem. Now, there are two main causes leading to this period of strife, and I've mentioned them. They are essentially the psychers and the warp problems. And without these two occurrences, it would have been impossible for humanity to be dislodged from their period of dominance. However, these two different problems, both relating to the warp, both occurring at the same time, led to this massive downfall in both technology and civilization. Many people became enslaved by psychers, as their power was obviously completely impossible to combat. And so insanity, demonic possession, and interhuman warfare became the norm in this period. Basically, warp storms made it impossible for anyone to travel. But there were the pocket empires that I mentioned earlier, and these were small areas of space that could be travelled to because there was maybe less warp storms, or maybe the warp storms were navigatable. We don't know at this point. But we do know that this meant that people were essentially inbreeding in a very small gene pool compared to what they had originally. And this led to a rise of abhumans, races such as the Ratlings, the Ogrins, and even the Squats. And of course, because of this weakness, other alien races who were less hindered by warp travel, relying on navigation, such as the Orcs, were primed and ready to take advantage of humanity's new weakness. Now, some of these small empires that were contained behind the warp storms actually flourished. However, in the Sol system, there was no such time for flourishing. Earth itself became a battleground. There was very few resources left over because obviously we'd used them all, relied upon the warp networks to bring us more supplies. Without this warp network, we devolved, essentially. The civilizations were knocked down into small groups, tribes, essentially, of techno-barbarians, ruled over by mad warlords and crazed psychers. By the 28th millennium, virtually all civilization that stood before on Earth was erased, and all that was left were ruins and rubble, which were burning in the fires of warfare. Many of the areas of Earth were divided into smaller territories, such as Hid Brazil, Ursh, the Indonesian bloc, the North African conclaves. You all recognise some of the names, but obviously it's quite hard to locate some areas, so we don't know exactly what happened and where it happened, although places like the Pan-Pacific Empire can be interpreted as you would expect. And on Earth, war was king. People were being destroyed by the thousands, millions were dead in unmarked graves. It was horrifying. It was complete and utter chaos, and it only ended when the Emperor, who was obviously still alive, but who had been in hiding up until this point, only guiding humanity from the background, had to step up, come forward and unite humanity again to prevent it from being destroyed. He essentially set out to conquer the techno-barbarians who were inhabiting the rest of Earth, and he united those who would be united and destroyed those who would not be united. And with his power, he was able to essentially conquer what he needed to conquer and became the ruler of Earth. And with that, he was able to find and reconstruct a lot of the technology we had lost, and begin constructing his Space Marine legions and his Primarchs, as those would be his ticket to essentially taking back the galaxy for humanity. On Mars, in fact, this was another area which was quite populous during the Dark Age of Technology. There was a very different transformation, as Mars had been the centre of technological innovation during the Dark Age of Technology. Now it was cut off from the rest of the Solar System, essentially being an isolationist community to begin with. And the tech priests of the cult Mechanicus eventually emerged victorious after unifying their homeworld in a similar war to what the Earth people suffered. However, here, civilization was not destroyed, essentially it was transformed. And what they did was essentially reconstruct what technology they could find and hoard it together, meaning the main purpose of their cult. Now, what they did during this period is quite foggy, but we know that they started constructing the Titans. These were the great fighting machines that we will talk about later on in their own video. And they also developed a way of mapping the warp storms, not to be able to navigate, but learning when lulls existed, and thus sending ships out in order to reclaim worlds as forge worlds, which we will talk about in their own video, but were essentially hubs of the cult Mechanicus, and were used to help forward the cause of the machine god in acquiring technology. However, eventually the Emperor would come to Mars and unify that under Earth's rule, but that will not come until a little bit later in our video. And in the outer systems of Terra, little is known, really. We know that there was a rather large military around Saturn called the Saturnite Fleet, and we knew that they had to do a lot of internal enforcing during the Horus Heresy. However, we don't know much about that, and we don't know anything about any of the other groups that used to inhabit this area of the solar system. Finally, we will talk about the end of the Age of Strife. Now, this was when the Eldar Empire reached its height. They hadn't been affected by the warp storms. They used something called the Webway to navigate between worlds, but their decadence was reaching such a height that eventually it could go no higher. And this finally led to the birth of the Chaos god Slaanesh, their psychic might made manifest as an evil demonic god. Now, this was a cataclysmic event. It annihilated the Elder worlds, and it did kill millions upon millions. However, this actually had a beneficial side effect for the Emperor, who had united the Earth clans and united Mars and the rest of the solar system, because now the warp storms were gone. They had been consumed, destroyed, in the birth of Slaanesh, the warp becoming calm for the first time in millennia. And now we had a key, we had the ticket out of Earth and into the rest of the galaxy. And this was the beginning of the Great Crusade. Now, I will mention the Great Crusade in far greater detail in another video. It requires far more explanation than I can give it now. I don't want to do it any injustice by essentially skimping on content. So all I will say that it began in the 30th millennium and ended in the 31st millennium, which is quite a short period of history, but in that period of history many things happened. It also contained within this period the Horus Heresy, which was the fire of war which eventually forged the Imperium into what we see today. As I said, we'll talk about that in its own videos. We don't want to spoil it for you, do we? Right, that's the end of our first video. We will come to you next week with another video. This one will be detailing the ages of the Imperium. This will be essentially from the end of the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy right up until today, which contains some very interesting points. So I hope you stay tuned, and we'll see you again next week.
See you next time on Vaults of Terra!